The stagecoach had been gone for 4 hours, but its dust still seemed to hang over Pike's trading post like the ghost of a bad decision. It had settled on the porch planks, on the mule rail, on the brass-bound trunk sitting crooked by the dead stove, and on the woman beside it who had nowhere left to go. Evening was coming down hard over the Bitterroot Mountains. The peaks stood black against a bruised purple sky, their shoulders already carrying the first white warning of winter. By midnight, the mud outside would freeze stiff enough to cut a man's boot leather. By dawn, anything left without shelter would be either gone or dead. Mabel Whitcomb sat with both hands folded over a beaded reticule in her lap. She had not moved much since Harvey Bledsoe rode away. Her dark traveling dress was too heavy for the stale warmth of the trading post and too fine for the mud that had swallowed the hem. The seams strained at her shoulders and hips. Her face was flushed from the long stage ride, the humiliation, and the fire that had gone out before anyone thought to feed it. She was a large woman, broad through the back, full in the arms, heavy in the waist and thigh. Every man in the room had noticed. Every man had made sure she knew he noticed. Harvey had noticed first. He had come in with a fresh-shaved jaw and a homesteader's hat held too proudly in his hand. He had read her letters for 3 months. He had written back saying he wanted a woman with strength, a woman who could work, a woman who would not fold under a Montana winter. But when the stage door opened and Mabel stepped down, Harvey's smile had died before her boots touched the ground. He had looked her over like livestock he had overpaid for. Then he had said loud enough for the porch to hear that he had asked for a wife, not a draft horse. After that, the day had split into pieces. Harvey refusing her trunk, Harvey saying he would not feed her through winter, Harvey keeping the return fare because, as he put it, she had misrepresented herself by omission. The stage driver shrugging, Silas Pike laughing through his nose, the horses pulling away, dust rising, dust settling, and Mabel left by the stove that had no fire in it. Silas Pike leaned behind the counter, picking at his teeth with a splinter. He was a narrow man with oily hair, a yellowed beard, and a talent for making cruelty sound like weather. He watched Mabel as if she might become his problem if he blinked too long. Nellie Shaw came from the back room carrying a chipped cup of coffee. She was a widow with gray at her temples and soap cracks along both hands. She set the cup on the trunk beside Mabel, not too close, not like pity. "Drink it while it's warm," Nellie said. Mabel looked at the cup. "Thank you." Her voice was low and rough from dust. Nellie glanced toward the men by the Cracker Barrel. "Keep your gloves on if you can. Men around Pike's place got eyes like coyotes." Mabel almost smiled, but the thing died before it reached her mouth. "Coyotes are honest. They only circle when they're hungry." Nellie's gaze softened. "You got people back east?" "Not the kind that send fare." Silas slapped the counter with his palm. "No use making a funeral out of it, Nellie. Woman ordered herself west and got turned back. Happens." "I was not turned back," Mabel said. The room stilled, not because she had spoken loudly, because she had spoken at all. Silas raised his brows. "No, I was left." Something hard passed through Nellie's face. Silas only gave a dry chuckle and looked toward the window. That was when Elias Crow pushed open the door. The leather hinges screamed. A blade of cold came in with him carrying the smell of pine-pitch mule sweat, old smoke, and high country snow. Elias stood in the doorway a moment, letting his eyes adjust. He was tall in a worn, narrow way, all bone and weather, with a tangled beard, a patched buckskin coat, and a rifle slung across his chest. Mud had dried in gray plates along his boots. His hat brim shadowed eyes that looked like they had grown tired of people years ago and never recovered. He didn't like coming down the mountain. The air below the ridge was thick with talk trade lies and men wanting more than they earned. He had come for salt, 50 pounds of flour coffee, cartridges lamp oil, and enough corn whiskey to keep Silas from calling it friendship. He stomped his boots once and shut the door. "Salt," Elias said. Silas grinned. "Got salt in the back." Then his eyes slid toward Mabel. "You want a wife to go with it? Got one going cheap." Mabel's fingers tightened around the reticule. The movement was small, but Elias saw it. He saw the white of her knuckles. He saw the way her jaw locked, not soft with tears, but hard with the effort of refusing them. "I want salt," Elias said. Silas spat into a tin near his boot and missed. Harvey Bledsoe ordered her clear out from Chicago. Paid fare, too. Stage dropped her off this morning. Harvey took one look and said he couldn't afford to feed a woman built for pulling stumps, rode back to his claim with her return money still in his pocket. The men by the Cracker Barrel snorted. Mabel stared at a knot in the floorboards. Elias turned his head slightly and looked out the window. The sky had gone darker. The wind was already moving through the mule rail ropes. He knew that wind. It came down from the high passes, sharp as a skinning knife. It did not ask whether a body had moneykin or a place in the world. "Not my affair," Elias said. "Ain't mine either." Silas answered, "I'm locking up before dark, heading toward Stevensville with the mail sack in a thirst. She can't stay here. She can wait for the stage. Stage don't come back for 10 days. Mabel's shoulders rose and fell once. Elias hated the sound of it, not because it was weak, because it was controlled. A woman begging was easier to walk away from. A woman sitting still while the world stripped her dignity down to the bone was harder. He looked at her trunk. Brass-bound, heavy, foolish thing for mountain country. Outside, an old Salish man stood by the mule rail, one hand on the neck of a patient gray mule. Topa Spotted Elk had been there when Elias rode in, wrapped in a dark wool blanket, his hair tied back, his face lined deep from wind and years. He had hauled goods through the Bitterroot trails longer than most white men had known the names of the creeks they crossed. Topa's eyes met Elias's through the window. Elias looked away. He told himself he had no cabin fit for company, no food to spare, no patience for a woman abandoned by another man's cowardice. He had lived 5 years with no voice in his room but the stove draft and his own breathing. He had earned that quiet. He had bled for it. He had buried what came before it. Then Topa's voice came from the open doorway, quiet but carrying. A woman left in the cold ain't freight no matter what a coward paid for her. Nobody laughed then. Silas rolled the splinter between his teeth and muttered something under his breath. Elias felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. He hated being judged by an old man who said little and saw too much. He hated Silas for being filthy-hearted. He hated Harvey Bledsoe for being small. Mostly he hated the knowledge that if he walked out with his salt and left the woman there, the cold would walk in after him and sit beside his bed all winter. He crossed the room toward Mabel. Up close she smelled of old sweat, cheap lavender water dust, and a long road endured without kindness. Her eyes lifted to his. They were brown flat and tired, but not empty. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mabel Whitcomb. You got a place to go?" "If I did Mr. Crow, I would not be sitting by a dead stove while strangers discuss my weight like the price of bacon." Nellie lowered her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched. Elias ground his teeth. "I live 5 miles up ridge. Trails steep, cabins small, sheds worse. You can stay until the stage comes back. You earn your keep. No crying, no complaining." Mabel studied him from boots to beard. She did not look relieved. She looked like a woman measuring one hardship against another. "I don't complain," she said, "but I will need help with my trunk." Elias looked at the trunk. "I ain't hauling that thing up the mountain. My winter clothes are in it." "Then take what you can carry. If I had known Montana men preferred women frozen smaller, I would have packed lighter." Nellie made a small sound and turned it into a cough. Elias stared at Mabel. Her face did not change. No tears, no simpering gratitude, no softness offered to make his mercy feel larger than it was. He swore under his breath and turned toward Silas. "Load the trunk on the mule." Silas barked a laugh. "You're a fool, Crow. She'll eat through your flour before first snow melts." Elias's eyes cut to him. "Load the damn trunk." The room went still again. Silas lifted both hands, grinning without humor, and came around the counter. Outside, Topa began adjusting the mule rigging without being asked. Nellie stepped close to Mabel and pressed a small paper twist into her palm. "Tea," Nellie whispered, "and dried apple. Don't let him make you live on beans and spite." Mabel closed her fingers around it. For the first time all day, her eyes brightened dangerously. "Thank you. Keep that stick straight back of yours," Nellie said. "A man can mistake silence for permission if a woman bends too low." Mabel nodded once. Outside, the air bit harder than it had minutes before. Elias loaded flour over one shoulder and tied coffee salt lamp oil in cartridges beside the trunk. The mule shifted under the weight and gave a low complaint. Topa checked the knots, then placed 2 fingers briefly against the animal's neck. "Snow by morning," Topa said. Elias glanced toward the ridge. "I know you walk fast when you want to leave something behind." Elias tightened his strap. "Trail don't care how a person feels." "No," Topa said, "only whether they can last." Mabel stepped off the porch into the mud. Her skirt dragged at once. She lifted it with one hand and held her reticule with the other. The men by the door watched her. Silas smirked. Harvey Bledsoe was gone, but the shape of his insult still stood among them. Elias started up the trail without looking back. For the first mile, he heard every part of her struggle. The wet pull of her boots in mud, the snap of brush against her dress, the thin, hard drag of breath in her throat. He did not slow. Slowing would mean caring, and caring was how the world got its teeth into a man. Behind him, Mabel stumbled but did not call out. The trading post dropped lower through the pines until its lamplight became a dull yellow eye in the darkening valley. The mountains rose ahead, black and waiting. The wind moved through the lodgepoles with a sound like distant water. Elias told himself he had only kept a woman from freezing, nothing more. Then Mabel's breath came again behind him, rough, stubborn, alive, following him up into the cold. And for the first time in years, Elias Crow's quiet did not belong entirely to him. The mountain took the light before the valley was done with it. Elias Crow climbed as if darkness had no right to catch him. The flour sack rode across his shoulders like a dead man, 50 pounds of white weight pressing into bone and muscle. His rifle bumped against his chest. The mule trudged behind him, breath blowing in pale bursts, ears twitching under the burden of salt coffee cartridges, lamp oil, and Mabel Whitcomb's brass-bound trunk. Behind the mule came Mabel. At first, Elias tried not to hear her. He fixed his eyes on the faint track ahead, on the roots lifting through the frozen mud, on the shale that waited loose and treacherous beneath the pine needles. He knew every bend of that trail. It had been cut by elk weather and stubborn men who had more need than sense. It climbed hard through lodgepole and fir, then crossed a slope of broken stone before reaching the granite shoulder where his cabin crouched. Mabel did not know any of it. Her city boots slipped where his found grip. Her dress caught on deadfall and brush. The cold thickened as they rose, and the air thinned in a way that made a lowland chest labor for every breath. The sound of her breathing followed him up the ridge, heavy and uneven like a bellows patched with wet cloth. Elias kept walking. He told himself she had chosen this. She had answered a letter. She had come west believing some homesteader's ink promises. Her misfortune was not his debt. He had given her shelter enough. No law, human or heavenly, required him to make the mountain gentle. A stone turned under Mabel's boot. She gave a short, hard sound, not quite a cry. Elias heard the wet slide of mud, the snap of brush, and then the heavy thud of her body hitting the ground. The mule stopped. Elias stopped too, though anger rose in him for doing it. He turned. Mabel lay on her side with her skirt twisted around her legs. One hand braced in the dirt, the other caught under her. Her hat had slipped back and strands of brown hair clung damply to her flushed face. The trunk on the mule creaked softly above her, as if even it had an opinion. Elias stood with the flour across his shoulders and waited. Get up, he thought. Don't make me carry you. Don't make me be better than I am. For a few seconds, she did not move. Then her fingers dug into the mud. She pushed herself upright slowly, painfully. When she lifted her hands, both palms were scraped raw, dark blood shining in the dirt. She looked at them once, then wiped them down the sides of her skirt as if blood were only another inconvenience. There was a dead branch beside the trail. She picked it up and leaned her weight on it. Which way, she asked. Her voice came ragged but not broken. Elias pointed with his chin. Up. Mabel passed him without another word. That was the first thing about her that troubled him. Not her size, not her trunk, not the way she took up more air than he was used to sharing. It was the fact that she had been mocked, abandoned, frozen, dragged half up a mountain, thrown into the dirt, and still had not asked any man to make the world easier. He walked on a little slower, though he hated himself for it. By the time they reached the cabin, night had settled thick between the pines. The moon was caught behind clouds, and the first loose grains of snow skittered across the ground like salt thrown from an unseen hand. Elias's cabin sat against a granite outcrop, squat and mean-looking, its log walls patched with mud and dry grass, its roof sagging under old weather. It looked less built than endured. He shoved the door open. The smell came out first. Old grease, dead ash, damp wool, unwashed bedding, drying pelts. A sharp animal stink from traps and hides hung near the rafters. Mabel stopped in the doorway, her broad shape blocking what little moonlight there was. She took one breath and her nose wrinkled before she could master it. Elias saw. Home, he said, setting the flour down hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Mabel stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under her boots. The cabin was hardly more than 12 feet by 10 with a rusted stove, a rough table crowded by traps, rifle parts, and a dirty skillet. A narrow cot shoved against the wall and bundles of pelts hanging low enough to brush Elias's hat brim. Mabel looked around slowly. "You said there was a shed. Shed roof caved in last winter. Then where am I to sleep?" Elias unbuckled his rifle strap and leaned the gun near the door. Floor. Mabel looked at the floorboards. They were warped, dirt-grimed, and drafty enough that cold air moved through the cracks. Then she looked at the cot, narrow and sagging. Then she looked at him. Her face was pale now from the climb. Dust clung to the sweat tracks on her cheeks. Blood had dried along the base of her palms, but her eyes were steady. "I take up room, Mr. Crow. The world has been telling me so since I was 12. Elias said nothing. "If I sleep on that floor," she continued, "I may not get back up without assistance, and if I cannot get up, you will have to step over me to reach your coffee. I doubt either of us wants that much intimacy before breakfast." The words landed flat and practical, with no begging in them. Elias glared at the cot as if it had betrayed him. Then he snatched his thick wool blanket from it and threw the blanket down beside the stove. "Take the bed," he said. "Don't break the frame." Mabel's jaw tightened, but she did not answer the insult. She only removed her gloves with care, wincing when the wool pulled at the torn skin of her hands. The first morning began with scraping. Elias woke on the floor with his back aching, and cold sunk deep into his bones. For a moment he did not understand the sound. Metal against metal, slow, determined, wrong. He sat up. Mabel stood at the stove wearing a faded brown skirt and an oversized flannel shirt belted at her waist, likely pulled from that ridiculous trunk. She had his hunting knife in one hand and his cast-iron skillet in the other. She was scraping a black layer of grease from the pan in stubborn curls. "What in God's name are you doing?" Elias demanded. "Looking for the bottom of this skillet. Put down my knife." It was dull. It was oiled. It had dried blood on it. He rose too quickly and nearly struck his head on a hanging pelt. "You don't touch my tools. I was going to make oats, then make them. I refuse to cook food in a pan that smells like a dead badger, then don't eat." He took the knife from her hand and slammed it on the table. Brass casings rolled off and scattered across the floor. Mabel didn't jump, but her shoulders drew inward for half a second. Elias saw that too, and it made him angrier because he had put the movement there. He grabbed his axe and went outside. He chopped wood until his palms burned. He split rounds that did not need splitting. He worked as if every log were Silas Pike's grin, Harvey Bledsoe's coward mouth, Topa's quiet judgment, and Mabel's steady eyes. By noon, his shirt stuck to his back despite the cold. When he came inside, the cabin was not clean. Nothing could make it clean in half a day, but it had changed. The table had been scrubbed down to pale wood. The traps had been moved to one corner. The skillet sat black and honest on the stove. Steam hung faintly in the air, carrying the smell of lye soap and boiled water beneath the old animal reek. On the table sat a tin plate of gray oats. Mabel sat on the cot with her hands folded loosely in her lap. The scraped places on her palms were angry red. "I used water," she said, "and salt. There was no milk, no sugar." Elias picked up the spoon and took a bite. The oats were cold thick and tasted like wet earth with regret in it. He swallowed. "They're cold. You were outside pouting." Elias stopped chewing. Mabel looked at him without expression. Something moved in his chest, a laugh maybe, something old and cracked from disuse. He buried it and took another bite. By late afternoon, a mule bell sounded outside. Elias opened the door and found Topa Spotted Elk leading a gray pack mule through the trees. The old man had a bundle tied in blanket cloth and a leather pouch hanging from his shoulder. Snowflakes rested in his hair but did not melt. "Brought what you traded for," Topa said. Elias stepped aside. Topa entered and took in the cabin with one glance: the scrubbed table, the moved traps, the woman on the cot, the cold oats, the blanket on the floor. His face changed not at all. He handed Elias the cinch strap, then looked at Mabel's hands. "You fell on stone," he said. Mabel lifted one palm slightly. The stone won. Topa opened his pouch and took out strips of willow bark and a small twist of dried bitterroot. "Boil this one for pain," he said, touching the willow. "This one for strength when food sits heavy and winter sits heavier." Mabel accepted them carefully. "Thank you." He nodded as if thanks were less important than remembering. Outside, the wind struck the wall. Topa turned his head toward the sound. "Clouds are wrong. Snow before morning, harder after." "I saw it," Elias said. Topa looked at him for a long moment. Seeing is not the same as preparing. Then he left as quietly as he had come. That night the cold found every crack in the cabin. The wind screamed down the stovepipe and pressed white breath through the floorboards. Elias lay on his pallet beside the stove, wrapped in the thin spare quilt, shivering so hard his teeth clicked. He had given Mabel the thick blanket because the cot held the draft from the wall, and because he was a fool, and because he could not take it back now without admitting he had meant to give it. The cot creaked. A moment later the heavy blanket dropped over him. "Take it back," he rasped. "You are freezing." "So are you. I have insulation," Mabel said. "I said take it back." She made a sound like tired thunder. Then the floorboards groaned as she lowered herself beside him. Elias went rigid. "What are you doing?" "Pooling resources." She pulled the thick blanket over both of them and dragged the thin quilt across the top. She lay with her back to him, broad and warm and impossibly near. Elias held himself at the edge of the bedding, proud enough to suffer and cold enough to hate pride. The wind hit the cabin again. Slowly, inch by inch, he shifted closer until his freezing back met the solid heat of hers. Mabel did not move away. Outside, snow began to strike the walls, sharp as thrown gravel. Inside, Elias stared into the dark, listening to her steady breathing, feeling the warmth he had not asked for and could not deny. By morning, the mountain had disappeared. There was no ridge, no trail, no line of pines beyond the one small window, only white. Snow drove sideways through the air with such force that it seemed less like weather than punishment. It struck the cabin logs in hard, dry bursts, hissed under the door, and packed itself against the lower wall until the room grew dim even after sunrise. Elias woke with his back pressed against Mabel Whitcomb's. For a moment he did not move. The fire in the stove had dropped low, but he was warm. Not comfortable, not exactly. His shoulder ached from the floorboards. His neck was stiff. His pride was in worse condition than both. But his bones were not frozen, and the steady heat of the woman beside him held the cold at bay like a second stove. Mabel breathed deep and slow. Not the desperate pull she had made climbing the trail, not the pained gasp of a woman trying to survive mudstone and insult. This was a sleeping breath, heavy and alive. Elias eased away before she woke and stood too fast, nearly striking his head on the hanging pelts. He fed the stove with split pine, then shoved his shoulder against the door. It opened only 3 inches before packed snow stopped it. He cursed. Mabel stirred beneath the blanket. That bad. Bad enough. She sat up slowly, hair loose around her face, cheeks marked from sleep and cold. She looked toward the door, then the window, then the low rafters trembling under the wind. There was no surprise in her expression, only a grim acceptance that made Elias think she had spent her life waking to bad news and finding somewhere to put it. How long, she asked. Depends on the wind. That is not an answer. It's the only one the mountain gives. The storm held them for 3 days. The world shrank to the size of Elias Crow's cabin. 10 by 12 feet of breath-smoke, grease-wet wool, and stubborn silence. The stove had to be fed hard and often. If it faltered, ice formed along the water bucket and the cold slipped through the floorboards like it had fingers. Elias worked near the stove because there was nowhere else to work. He sat cross-legged on the floor with a stiff beaver hide stretched across his knees, scraping the last yellow fat from the skin with a bone tool worn smooth at the grip. Scrape, pull, scrape, pull. The sound cut through the wind's long howl. Mabel sat on the cot with his torn shirts piled in her lap. She had found his sewing kit in a rusted tobacco tin, 1 dull needle, a few crooked pins, and heavy waxed thread. She mended without asking. A button here, a sleeve there, a tear under the arm where Elias had shoved his elbow through and kept wearing the shirt anyway. He watched her hands. They were not pretty hands, not soft parlor hands meant to rest over piano keys. They were wide, practical hands with thick fingers and blunt nails. The scrapes from the trail had cracked open twice, but she kept working. She pushed the needle through stubborn cloth with the heel of her palm and drew the thread tight with a snap. At first, she had moved carefully, trying not to take up too much space. Now there was no space left to negotiate. She reached for the kettle when she needed it. She rose from the cot and crossed in front of him if the fire wanted tending. She shifted his coffee tin without asking and put the skillet where she could find it. She occupied the room because the room had no mercy for shrinking. It irritated him. It steadied him, too. He always knew where she was. He knew the weight of her step, the rustle of her skirt, the small breath she took before bending toward the stove. He knew the smell of lye soap on her sleeves and the faint powder scent from her trunk now mixed with wood smoke and beans. On the second afternoon, the wind rose so hard the cabin groaned. Mabel looked up from a shirt. Is it built well enough to hold? No. Her needle paused. Elias scraped the hide, but it's too stubborn to fall. She studied the walls. That sounds like most men I've known. He nearly smiled. Nearly. Instead, he pressed the bone scraper harder against the hide. Too hard. The tool caught on a thick place, jumped and sliced across his left palm. Pain flashed white. Damn it. Blood welled fast, dark and hot. It ran through the dirt in his hand and dripped onto the floorboards Mabel had scrubbed raw. Elias clamped his fist shut, but blood pushed between his fingers. Mabel dropped the shirt and stood. Give me your hand. I can tie it. You have one working hand. I said I can tie it. And I said give it here before you bleed on every board I cleaned. She did not wait for permission. She stepped over his outstretched leg, took his wrist, and pulled his hand toward the basin. Her grip was strong enough to make him look at her. She poured cold water over the wound. Elias sucked air through his teeth. The cut was deep across the meat of his palm, splitting the old callus wide. Blood thinned pink in the basin, then came red again. Mabel reached for the bottle of corn whiskey on the shelf behind the coffee tin. Elias narrowed his eyes. Who told you that was there? You are not a mysterious man, Mr. Crow. You hide what matters behind coffee. Before he could answer, she poured whiskey straight into the cut. Fire tore through his hand. His arm jerked, but her fingers locked around his wrist and held him still. Stop twisting. I ain't twisting. You are attempting to leave your own arm. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth clicked. Mabel took a strip of clean white cotton from her apron pocket. Elias recognized the fabric. It had been torn from one of her petticoats. You don't need to ruin your things, he said. I've already been ruined in better rooms than this one. That shut him up. She wrapped his palm with efficient cruelty, pulling the cloth tight enough to force the cut together. Her face was close eyes, narrowed mouth, set in concentration. He could see a loose strand of hair stuck to her cheek. He could see the faint silver lines at the side of her throat where her skin creased into her collar. He could smell oatmeal whiskey soap and warm wool. The wind battered the wall. Elias looked at the top of her bowed head. Why did you come all this way for Bledsoe? Her hands stopped. For several seconds only the storm answered. Then she tied the bandage in a hard knot at the base of his thumb. Because Chicago had corners too small for me. Elias said nothing. Mabel kept her eyes on the knot. I was the fat spinster aunt before I had nieces enough to make it official. I sat in parlors while my younger sisters were courted. I poured tea. I laughed at jokes that had me hidden inside them. Men looked past me when they were kind and through me when they were not. She let go of his wrist, but he didn't draw his hand back. Harvey wrote that he wanted a woman with strength, said Montana was no place for a glass doll, said he needed a worker, a partner, a woman who could stand wind, snow, hunger, and hard labor. Her mouth twisted. He wanted a strong woman until strength came, shaped like me. The words settled in the cabin heavier than the storm. Elias looked at his bandaged hand. The cotton was neat and tight. The bleeding had already slowed. He's a fool, Elias said. Mabel looked at him then, really looked. Her brown eyes searched his face, hunting for the sneer, the hidden joke the small cruelty men tucked behind soft words. There was none. Elias did not know what to do with the look she gave him after that. It was not gratitude, not affection. It was the careful recognition of one wounded animal realizing another had not bitten. She picked up the whiskey and shoved the cork back in with the heel of her hand. You will need to keep that dry. Hard to do when trapped inside a snowbank. Then try being less dramatic. He glanced at her. This time the laugh broke loose before he could kill it. It was short and rough, more cough than joy, but it startled them both. Mabel's mouth softened, not quite a smile, but close enough to trouble him. Far below the ridge, Pike's trading post sat under the same storm, though the wind there had less teeth. Silas Pike stood by the stove with a cigar clamped between his lips, telling two freighters that Elias Crow had likely discovered charity was expensive when it came dressed in that much wool. Nellie Shaw, kneading biscuit dough near the back table, slapped flour from her hands and turned on him. Men like you laugh because it costs nothing, she said. Harvey Bledsoe wanted a woman to cook Mendenhall, warm his bed, and save him from dying alone. Then he found out she had flesh enough for folks to see, and his courage ran out. Silas rolled his eyes. You taking up for her because widows and spinsters share a hymn book? Nellie's face went still. I take up for her because she stood there with every man in this room, cutting pieces off her, and did not give you the satisfaction of bleeding. Near the door, Topa-spotted elk warmed his hands around a tin cup. He did not look at Silas when he spoke. The mountain does not care if a person is pleasing, he said. Only if they know how to last. The freighter said nothing after that. By the third night, the storm began to tire. Its scream softened into a long, wounded moan. The cabin walls stopped trembling. The fire burned low red coals pulsing behind the stove door like the eye of some sleeping creature. Elias lay on the floor, bandaged hand resting on his chest. He heard Mabel shift on the cot, heard the blanket drag, heard the boards complain as she lowered herself beside him. The thick wool settled over his shoulder. He did not tell her to go back. She lay with her back to his warm and solid. Elias turned carefully, fitting himself against that heat without pretending accident. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing useful to say that their bodies had not already admitted. In the morning, the silence woke him. Not true silence. The drip of meltwater tapped from the eaves. The stove ticked. The mule snorted somewhere beyond the wall. But the wind had gone. Elias forced the door open against soft snow. Sun struck the world so bright it hurt. The Bitterroot slopes glittered under a hard blue sky, buried and beautiful and dangerous. Mabel stood behind him in her stained traveling dress, hair pinned back, reticule in hand. She looked like the woman from the trading post and not like her at all. "The stage will come today," she asked. "Likely." He nodded toward the mule. "Best start down before the trail turns worse." She looked at him once as if waiting for something more. Elias gave her nothing because he did not know how. So Mabel took up her walking stick and stepped into the snow. Elias led the mule down the mountain slower than he had climbed it. Behind him came the steady thud of her stick, the heavy press of her boots, and her breathing, hard but even. The sound followed him through the trees, and with every step toward the valley, the cabin behind them seemed to grow colder. The trail down from Elias Crow's cabin had learned new ways to be cruel. Snowmelt ran under the white crust in thin, hidden streams, turning the earth beneath into slick black mud. Roots shone with ice, stones rolled loose underfoot. The pine branches, heavy with wet snow, bent low over the track and slapped cold water onto shoulders, hats, and faces, as if the mountain itself were trying to drive them back. Elias walked first, one hand on the mule's lead rope, his other wrapped in Mabel's bandage and tucked close to his coat. The cut in his palm throbbed with each step. Behind him came the sound he had come to know too well, the steady thud of Mabel Whitcomb's walking stick, the drag of her skirt through brush, and the hard pull of her breath in the thin morning air. Only now it was different. On the climb up, her breathing had been desperate, a broken sound, a woman fighting the mountain and losing ground with every yard. Now it was heavy, yes, but measured. She planted the stick, stepped, breathed, planted again. She did not ask to stop. She did not fall. When the trail narrowed, Elias slowed before he meant to. When a root crossed the path, he kicked snow off it with his boot. When the mule balked at a washed-out turn, he steadied the animal longer than he needed, giving Mabel time to catch up without making a charity of it. Neither of them spoke of it. The Bitterroot Valley opened below them, pale and wet under a hard blue sky. Smoke lifted from Pike's trading post in a thin gray thread. The sight ought to have brought relief. The stagecoach would come. Mabel would leave. Elias would take his mule, his supplies, his cut hand, and his reclaimed quiet back up the ridge. That had been the bargain. 10 days, shelter, work for keep, no crying, no complaining. The bargain had seemed clean when he made it. It didn't seem clean now. Mabel slipped once near the creek crossing. Elias turned fast, but she had already caught herself against a pine trunk. Her face was flushed from effort, her hair pinned badly beneath her hat, her traveling dress stained at the hem and sleeves. The woman who had sat beside the dead stove at Pike's trading post had looked like shame had been piled on her until she could hardly breathe under it. This woman looked tired, muddy, weather-burned, but not broken. "You need a minute?" Elias asked. Mabel lifted her eyes to him. "Do you?" "No." "Then keep walking." He did. By the time they reached the trading post, the sun had dropped low enough to cast long blue shadows across the yard. The stagecoach stood near the porch. 4 horses steaming in their harness sides, heaving tails, twitching at cold flies. The driver, a narrow man with a face like chewed leather, was tying mailbags to the roof. A wheel leaned in the mud where someone had greased the axle too late. The whole place smelled of wet horse tobacco smoke, spilled kerosene, and thawing manure. Silas Pike stood on the porch with a cigar in his mouth. His grin came before his greeting. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas called. Crow came back with all his fingers and most of the woman. "Thought maybe one of you would eat the other before the thaw." Mabel's stick struck the mud once, hard. Elias did not look at Silas. If he had, he might have done something that would cost more than pride. Nellie Shaw appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes went first to Mabel's face, then to her scraped hands, then to the walking stick. Something like relief softened the hard lines around her mouth. "You made it down," Nellie said. Mabel nodded, mostly upright. "That counts for plenty out here." Near the mule rail, Taupa-spotted elk stood with his gray mule tightening a strap on a pack saddle. He looked at Mabel for a long moment, then at the mountain behind her. He gave one small nod as if the trail itself had reported favorably. Elias led his mule to the coach and began untying the brass-bound trunk. The rope had frozen in places overnight and stiffened again in the air. He worked it loose with his good hand and teeth, then dragged the trunk down. It landed in the mud with a wet final slap. Mabel walked to the stage driver. "I need passage," she said. Her voice carried clear over the horses and the creak of leather. "Denver, or wherever this line ends." The driver looked her up and down, not as cruelly as Harvey Bledsoe had, but plainly enough that Elias felt his shoulders tighten. "Fare's $12 to Denver," the driver said. "Up front." Mabel's hand closed around the beaded reticule. It was a small, useless thing, too delicate for the mud, too empty to matter. Her knuckles whitened. She had no money. Elias knew it. Silas knew it. Nellie knew it. The knowledge moved through the yard like a cold draft under a door. For one moment the old shame tried to take her again. Elias saw it cross her face, faint but sharp. The porch, the watching men, the trunk, the stage, the price of leaving placed before her when every cent had been stolen by a coward who rode away feeling wronged. But Mabel did not beg. She turned toward Elias. That was all. He reached into his coat and drew out the leather pouch tied inside. The silver in it was last season's trapping money. It was salt and coffee after Christmas, shot and oats for the mule, nails if the roof shifted, medicine if fever came. It was winter counted in coins. He untied the pouch and counted $12 into the driver's dirty palm. The driver bit one coin, grunted, and nodded toward the open coach door. "Get in." Mabel looked at Elias. Her eyes were bright, but her voice held steady. "You kept your word, Mr. Crow." He hated the sound of that, not because it accused him, because it forgave him too quickly. "You got fare," he said. "I'm obliged to you." She turned and took hold of the iron rail beside the coach door. Her first step made the springs groan. Silas let out a short, ugly laugh from the porch, the same kind of laugh he had given when Harvey Bledsoe left her by the stove. That laugh went through Elias like a knife slipped between ribs. He saw the cabin. Not as it had been before her, but as it would be after. The cot with no weight on it, the table without the plate of terrible oats, the shirts half mended and folded too neatly, the stove ticking cold because no one had scolded him into feeding it proper, the floorboards where he would lie alone with a thin quilt and all the quiet he once thought he wanted. Quiet. The word turned in him and showed its other face, empty. Mabel lifted her other foot toward the coach. Elias moved. He grabbed the brass handle of her trunk, hauled it up out of the mud with a grunt, and swung it back toward the mule. The driver shouted. Silas's laugh cut off. Elias shoved the trunk onto the mule's pack frame and tied it down with one hard pull that burned through his bandaged palm. Mabel froze on the coach step. "What are you doing?" she asked. Elias turned back to her. His heart was beating too hard. He hated the yard. The watching faces, the sunlight, the way need stood naked in him with nowhere decent to hide. "Get down." Her expression closed. "I am not a charity case, Elias Crow. I didn't say you were. You bought my ticket." "I did." "Then let me leave." He looked at her hand gripping the rail, at the mud on her skirt, at the windburn across her cheeks. He remembered her saying Chicago had corners too small for her. He remembered the bandage around his palm, the weight of her back against his in the cold, the sound of her breathing in the dark. "I ain't offering charity," he said. Silas snorted from the porch. "What are you offering, then?" Elias's eyes never left Mabel. "My floorboards are loose. Stove draft's busted. Shirts still need mending. You left blood on my knife, and I reckon you owe me for dulling it." Mabel stared at him. "I cleaned that knife. You did it wrong. I did not. You can prove it when we get back." The driver cursed under his breath. "Lady, you riding or not?" Mabel did not answer him. She looked only at Elias. The yard seemed to fall quiet around them. "I am a heavy woman," she said. "I take up a lot of room." Elias swallowed. The words had cut her once. He would not let them cut her now. "I got a reinforced floor and I sleep better when the draft is blocked." No one laughed. Even the horses seemed to stand quieter in their traces. Mabel's grip on the rail loosened. The hard line of her mouth trembled not into tears but toward something more dangerous. Hope, maybe. Or the first careful edge of believing a man could mean what he said without knowing how to say it properly. She stepped down from the coach. Her boots landed square in the mud in front of him. "I refuse to cook your oats until you buy decent salt," she said. The breath went out of Elias slowly. "I'll buy the damn salt." Nellie Shaw came down from the porch and placed a small cloth bundle into Mabel's hand. "Dried apples," she said, "and clean strips. Mountain men bleed more than they admit." Mabel closed her fingers around the bundle. "Thank you, Nellie." Topa stood beside the mule rail, his face unreadable beneath the weathered lines. As Elias checked the trunk rope, the old man spoke softly enough that only the three of them heard. "A house becomes a home when people stop measuring the room and start sharing the fire." Elias pretended to tighten the knot. Mabel looked at Topa and nodded. The stage driver snapped the reins. The coach lurched forward, wheels sucking mud horses straining toward the road east. Silas watched from the porch with his cigar gone cold between his fingers. Elias led the mule toward the tree line. Mabel walked beside him, not behind. Her steps were slow and heavy. Her skirt brushed wet grass. Her walking stick struck the earth with a rhythm that matched the mule bell and the distant drip of thaw from the pines. The mountain waited above them, white and hard and honest. Winter was still coming. The cabin was still small. The stove still drafted. The floor still groaned. There would be bad oats, bitter cold, sharp words, and long silences neither of them yet knew how to fill. But as they left the trading post behind, Elias listened to Mabel's breathing beside him, loud and steady in the clean mountain air. For the first time in years, he did not miss the quiet.